Brief introduction to our speaker today. Professor Joel Eisen is a law professor with over 15 years of experience in teaching and research expertise, publications in renewable energy, and a specialization of energy and climate in China, as well as urban redevelopment. His recent article, Residential Renewable Energy, by Whom? Was recently selected by the Environmental Law Institute and the Vanderbilt Law School as one of the top 4 environmental law articles of 2011. Professor Eisen teaches courses in environmental law, energy law, and the law of climate change, and environmental and energy law in China. He also teaches environmental law and policy courses to undergraduate students at the University of Richmond's Environmental Studies program. And he was also recently a Fulbright professor of law at China University's School of Political Science and Law in Beijing. And as Dean Babbitt has indicated, he's going to speak today on the topic of smart regulation, federalism, and the smart grid. Professor Eisen.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure. It's a pleasure to be the inaugural speaker in this forum. Can you all hear me there in the back? Yes. Great. The smart grid. How many of you have heard the term smart grid? All right, this is good. Good audience. I feel at times like when I'm speaking about this topic, it's like Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future. You don't know about this, but your children will. It's something that is years away. But and it almost defies description today. It's America's next great network. We're building the foundation for America's next great network, like the internet. The internet model breaks down a bit at times, as you'll see, but think of the internet in 1995 and building the foundation for it, you won't go far wrong. Definitions are hard to find, but it's generally considered to mean 2 different things. On the left, modernizing the electric grid with intelligent systems, the actual technology to bring largely analog systems of the electric grid up to snuff, up to modern standards. On the right, replacing electricity's one-way flow to the homes. Most people know electricity today as a wire to the house, a monthly bill, still on paper for most people, and trucks that roll during storms when the power goes out. The smart grid can mean so much more than that. I'm going to talk about some of the consumer-facing applications that people have talked about with the grid. In the middle is my idea about smartness, and that is a concept we all understand in this era of the internet, and that is innovating smartly. Doing things in a smart way, doing things with the innovation ethic that we've come to understand from people like app developers. And that means not only technology, but regulation and business models that are appropriate to the smart grid as it develops. We'll see what I mean by smartness in a moment. I'm using an example of the technical standards for the smart grid and how they're being developed, and more importantly, who's developing them. That is an example, an initial test of what we might think of as smartness for the grid. Right? If you think about the internet in 1995, it's nothing like what today is. That's actually Yahoo's webpage from 1995. Obviously, things have changed substantially since then. The landscape right now looks like 1995. It looks like the internet of 1995. The stimulus bill put millions of dollars out on the street for smart grid demonstration projects. Millions of smart meters have been installed. We'll talk about what they are. But a robust network like the internet of 1995 is many years away. And much of what needs to support it, from the law side, from the policy side, from the technology side, that's something you all are going to invent and work with over the next 15 years. And those standards, rules of the road that will govern how this process works for many years to come. Here's what the smart grid looks like. How many of you have seen something that looks like this? Okay, some of you have. This is a conceptual model of the smart grid designed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, in their initial smart grid standards framework. The circled area in the right side there is you, the customer premises. The rest of that is what we might think of as the transmission system, the utility system. And these are all links that are there and links that might be there and links that we hope will be there. Here's how a utility sees it. Their infrastructure, your infrastructure, bringing in all of these wind turbines, bringing in energy storage. If batteries are ever developed in commercial, are ever made commercial for electricity, they could be a game changer, but they have to hook up to everything else on the grid. And here's something I want you to think about. If this is like the 1990s and the internet, this model here will not be the model that we talk about 15 years from now. Somebody, like this guy, will come along and redraw the model and put connections on it that we thought were not possible beforehand. The technical standards that we put in place should make this possible. You've got a lot of actors in the picture. I do not assume, by the way, that most of you have gone through a course in electric utility regulation. We have utilities, and there are different flavors of utilities depending on whether you're in a state that has restructured, partially deregulated, or not. State public utility commissions are important because for now, state commissions approve the projects that deploy smart grid systems. Vendors, as you'll see in a moment, hundreds of companies betting millions of dollars on this system. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that regulates electricity at wholesale transmission. National Institute of Standards of Technology, we've already mentioned them. Energy services companies that are trying to figure out how to get into this business and manage electricity, manage energy efficiency, manage large industrial and commercial buildings, and so forth. And then I have something at the bottom that is new entrants. Whoever these new Steve Jobses are going to be in this system, we don't even know who they are just yet. Just in the home area network space alone, that is, trying to network electricity savings, energy efficiency, behind the meter in your house. There are already 200 companies playing there. This is a who's who of major companies, Cisco, Siemens, many, many others. Okay, so the smart grid is generally considered to be these two different purposes. The first one is bringing the grid up to par. Technologies like synchrophasers deployed on the grid can reroute electricity around a distribution line, can give grid operators the chance to see everything that's going on right now. I sat in a room about the size of this one, about where you're sitting, across the room from about where she's sitting. You would have been the chief executive officer of a major investor-owned utility. And he said to everyone assembled in the room, the only way that we know that Judy's power is out is if Judy picks up the phone and calls us. That is not smart, but it could be smarter if the utilities put a lot of systems in place. For them, this is what the smart grid means by and large. They want increased computerized abilities to do things like balance power flows, to respond to outages in real time. That's what they want. Well, what we could get from the smart grid is a whole lot different. It starts with something called a smart meter. And that is a picture of an actual smart meter there. Right now, the electric meter that's connected to your home does one thing. It measures electricity. It does nothing else. Okay? To have any kind of consumer-facing application, we have to have intelligence in that box, in that smart meter. And utilities are rolling out these smart meters today. And I want to caution you about something right there. That box doesn't have to be a utilities meter. Okay? My iPad is sitting right over there. I could use that to get real-time data about the performance of my house's electric system. So you see a smart meter there today, but think that it might be other businesses, other entrants. The broadband companies are already trying to get into these businesses. Smart meter projects all over the country. This is an actual Google map that updates regularly. What can we do with this smart meter? Many different things. Again, this is 1995, not 2012, in terms of our thinking about this. Energy management in your house. You could walk up to that panel and control electric usage in your house in a lot more granular fashion than you can right now. Integrate your solar panel in there. Integrate your solar panel so that it could sell power back to the utility when the utility needs it. Plug in electric vehicles. As amazing as this might sound to you, what people want to do is something called vehicle to grid. Use the vehicle battery as a source of electric storage and use the power in that to sell that back to the grid when it's needed. All of that depends on smart meter and intelligent technologies within the house. This could be done in a number of different ways. Here are just two different options here. I'll get back to this in a second. I just wanted to show you that this could be done in many different ways. We're talking about smart appliances now. Companies are starting to get into the idea of having intelligence in a washing machine. A washing machine could respond to the price of electricity and turn on when it's cheaper to do so. Obviously, that requires a lot more intelligence in the white goods than are there today, but it also requires more intelligence in the system itself. Smart demand response. Think of the kind of things that could happen here. Your plug-in hybrid car knows when there's extra solar power or cheap wind power on the grid, and that's when it recharges itself for the next day's commute. Okay? This is one of many different activities that falls under the umbrella of something called demand response. Demand response is you responding to the price of electricity by cutting your demand for it, either automatically by you doing it or by a utility doing it. In the smart grid, it could work a lot differently. Notice that lower left-hand corner talks about somebody called an aggregator. Who is that? We don't know. They don't exist today. I mean, they do, and there are some firms out there trying to start doing this. Firms like Enernoc and Opower and Tendril are out there trying to be the firm that advises you about how to cut your consumption of electricity, and they might actually do it through software and hardware that is linked up to your individual devices in your house. Integration of distributed generation, typically renewables. We can have your solar panel, again, sell power back to the grid when the price is at a premium. The lower right-hand corner shows you the technologies are numerous and don't largely exist today. What could all this do for us? Some studies have estimated that it could be a substantial part of our response to climate change. If you could get 1 million washing machines or 1 million freezers to use incrementally less electricity, that keeps a utility from having to turn on a peaking power plant at that particular time that it needs it. Just a small example of the many benefits that we could get out of having an interconnected dynamic grid. A lot of what this depends on is something called dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is real-time pricing of electricity. I ask my students this all the time. What's the price of gasoline? Everybody around the table would say $3.50, $3.40. You can get it within 10 cents. Okay? What's the price of electricity per kilowatt hour in Maryland, DC, and Virginia right now? Some of you might know, but not all. Okay? Typically, we have no idea. The only real price signal that most consumers have is that monthly bill that comes at the end of the month. It certainly doesn't tell you anything about what individual devices use, and it doesn't tell you how much you used at particular times of the day. Dynamic pricing changes this with all kinds of different flavors, and studies have shown that if people are willing to embrace this, if consumers are willing to embrace it, we could have significant savings. Without that price signal, the washing machine doesn't know when the price of electricity is higher or lower, it doesn't get that price signal about when to turn on. Again, I assume most of you are not typically familiar with state utility regulation. Most smart grid projects on the distribution system go through state public utility commissions that approve those on the basis of the traditional principles of what's called cost of service regulation, the regulation that is designed to regulate the utilities to make sure that they can earn a fair rate of return. This is not a system that encourages technological innovation at all, and in fact, we have to find a way at some point to bypass it in order for the smart grid to mostly become a reality. There are a lot of smart grid deployments out there. PG&E in California has 8 million smart meters on the ground, is going to spend $1 billion over the next 20 years, according to a plan they came out with last year. XL Energy in Boulder will return to them. They're trying to wire 50,000 homes in Boulder, Colorado. And they had a 200% cost overrun up to $45 million. They're trying to recover some of that from the ratepayers. Baltimore Gas and Electric has 1.3 million smart meters going out and is coming up with something called the Online Smart Energy Manager this year. Their proposal was scaled back in a very high-profile proceeding before the Maryland Public Service Commission that refused to allow the utility to impose mandatory time-of-use pricing on consumers. Well, all right, who wants this? The short answer is, well, no one. No one's lining up at an Apple store right now. That happens to be the Apple store in New York City. Nobody's lining up at an Apple store right now to demand $20 off their electric bill. It's not happening, okay? So when will it happen? The answer is we don't know. But I think it will happen. But it will not happen by the utilities doing it because they have lived with this traditional regulatory environment for so long that they are not dynamic innovators. And the literature about disruptive innovation tells us that incumbents like utilities are not the ones who typically make the innovations that drive something like the smart grid. Okay, keep that in mind when we talk about writing the rules. Consumer education. Study last year found that 53% of Americans are not at all familiar with the smart grid. I say that my article is about the smart grid. People look at me like, what's that? Okay? I suspect if you had said the word internet to most Americans in 1990, they would have said, what's that? Okay. Meanwhile, early projects have encountered some resistance. You remember I talked about Boulder a moment ago. That's a shot in the lower right-hand corner from there. Boulder had a municipal referendum to kick XL Energy out of Boulder. The cost overruns on the smart grid project were really a small fraction of what citizens were angry about. They were mostly angry that most of XL's generation was done by polluting old coal-fired power plants. The other two are from California, where consumers have been concerned about radiation from smart meters. The science proves fairly conclusively that there is not a significant health hazard there, but PG&E has had to backtrack and scale back its smart meter deployment and actually allow people to opt out of smart meters. These, I would point out, are the same people who are going to come forward 10 years from now and say, we desperately want our smart meter. Okay, now to the meat of what I want to talk about, and that is standards for the smart grid. NIST said 2 years ago in something called its framework that there's an urgent need for standards and protocols. And again, I assume no familiarity whatsoever with technical standards here. I say technical standards, most people's eyes just glaze over. But you want to think about this as rules of the road. They are not at all just dry technical documents. Instead, they're going to define interactions on all those various points of the smart grid for decades to come. And we have a question. We're putting millions of smart meters out there, some of them, by the way, with version 1.0 of some of the technology. Do we put the meters out there and learn what works and what doesn't. Learn what consumers want and what they don't want. Learn whether energy efficiency programs will work and whether they won't work, and then write the standards. Or do the standards come first, or do they both come at the same time? Okay? Well, you have an interesting risk, an interesting set of risks if you don't write the standards first. The first one is most of the approvals are done at the state level, at the public utility commissions. So you could have 51 different commissions, including DC of course, deciding what to do. Okay? You could also have states approving projects without any kind of standards whatsoever because there's no guidance about what to do. And public utility commissions are not exactly known for their technical expertise in deciding what sort of standards should be applied in intelligent systems across the grid. The third one is a much more interesting problem, and it's worth an hour or two in its own right, and that is cybersecurity. We're going to increase by many orders of magnitude the points on the grid where people have access to it. If I hook up a solar panel on my house in Richmond, Virginia, to the electric grid, that is potentially a point, and by the way, owned by me, not a utility, where somebody could attack the grid. There are a lot of people a lot smarter than me who are worrying about cybersecurity. It's worth a few hours in its own right. I would say this, as you're going to see, cybersecurity is not the kind of problem you want to have mandated by a central authority. You want the work on this to be decentralized among a crowd of people who have responsibility for figuring out what it is. All right, key definitions here. Interoperability. Interoperability means that networks, devices, and systems can work together. We call these interoperability standards. The second key definition, use case. The smart grid is mostly a model right now. It doesn't exist. It's hard to define something that doesn't exist. But yet, if we're going to write the rules for it, we need to figure out what it is. And so we come up with the use case, which is basically a series of lines that tell us how actors and inputs would work throughout the system. This one, for example, is the various levels of interaction that would have to happen for consumers to reduce their demand for electricity. Okay? Who has to communicate with who? Where do they have to communicate? When do they have to communicate? That's the starting point. So you're basically modeling an individual subsystem, if you will. Here's another one for something called wide area situational awareness. This is the fancy name for the system operator's ability to see what's going on the electric grid at all times. When I say that I'm interested in the standards for the smart grid, one of the responses that I get quite frequently is, oh, well, that's just technical stuff. But we know better. We know that standards standardize interactions. And that means when we're eliminating the barriers to those interactions, they also define how those interactions take place. I'm going to show you a number of examples where the standards and the architecture of the smart grid are codependent. Okay? So that it's not simply writing the rules and letting the deployments follow. Instead, the rules depend on what choice of architecture we want to make. Even the most basic and fundamental choices will have enormous consequences, legal and financial, for the future. Here's what the situation looks like today. Utilities have developed their systems. In some cases, their own systems, their customer information systems, their grid awareness systems, independently of one another by relying upon proprietary vendors. Okay? So they not only don't even communicate with one another, customer system doesn't communicate with the outage awareness system at Dominion. My research assistant told me that yesterday. But Dominion's system don't talk to BG&E's system. Okay? This is the way the grid is today. Interoperability is breaking down the walls and allowing the entire grid, systems on the entire grid, to talk to one another. Well, interoperability can mean a number of different things. We all know this. Okay? There are plugs right here that plug into an electrical outlet that then goes into the wall. So plug and play, we tend to think of that, right? Plug is one level of interoperability. It actually physically connects together, light bulb into a socket. Okay? But there are a number of different levels of interoperability. Can those two connections exchange data? Can they relate to that data in a way that is useful and meaningful? What is that? Okay? So interoperability means a lot more than just simply can they actually physically connect together, and this is a set of decisions that we make every time we sit down to write the standards. Here's a simple example, something called the canonical data model. If I have my system and you have yours, they need to talk to one another. They need a language, a data model, like that Phoenician alphabet. Otherwise, that talking doesn't occur. Okay? Here's an example of standards drive architecture, architecture drive standards. There are two different ways that we could manage demand response. You could do it. If you see that line there, that's basically your house. Okay? You could do it, or the utility could do it. I took part in a pilot program run by Dominion Virginia Power last year. They put a little box on the air conditioner, and they cycled the air conditioner off for 15 minutes at a time during the summer on high demand days. They did it, not me. Okay? So what does the standard do? Does the standard allow for one type of interaction, for the other type of interaction? Again, these are choices that we're going to be making as we go along. Two major themes that I've got here for you to think about. The first one is, who does this? Is it done by the private sector? Is it done by the government or some other model? What impact does energy federalism have? Remember, I said regulation and federalism. The federal government and the states exist, I wrote in the article, like wary family members with checkered history and painful memories. And in particular, they went through a 10-year battle about restructuring and fought each other tooth and nail for well over a decade. That is something you have to account for in the development of anything related to the smart grid, much less the standards here. We have a strong tradition in this country of standards being written by the industry. If you think about organizations you might be familiar with, IEEE, ASTM, these are independent organizations, not run by the government, that drive the development of standards. And it's done without any assistance from the government. It's also done in a way that develops what we think of as consensus, voluntary consensus standards. The consensus consists of two parts, really. A voting consensus, which is what I'll call it, and that is members of the organization vote to approve a standard. Notice I said members of the organization. If you're someone who's going to come along later as a new entrant, you're not a member of IEEE today. Something to think about. The second part of this consensus is very important, and that is it's achieved consensus in the marketplace. People have made plugs that fit the standard, and that works. In other words, we know, looking at this plug, that it actually does work on products that are implemented in the marketplace. That's a second and very important part of what consensus is. The smart grid has to be different. For one thing, we have, think back to that spaghetti diagram of the use case. We have thousands of actors here, thousands of interactions to define, many different kinds of systems. If we let the private sector go at it on its own, it would be something like the Tower of Babel. Even more importantly, we have national goals like cybersecurity. We have to make sure that the grid is secure, and we're not sure that leaving it to the private sector would achieve that. No one standards development organization could do all this by itself. They don't have the expertise. And then, as NIST decided in its framework, there's a sort of cross-functionality. we might be asking a standards group to do something that it has never done, it's not within its jurisdiction. The example I use is vehicle to grid, which I mentioned earlier. So here's one simple example of how vehicle to grid might work. You're actually plugged in the garage, you're linked up to your home router, which in turn is linked to the utility. Okay? That would require these different standards development organizations to collaborate. SAE, which is automotive standards. Some of you may have read about the various plug configurations for electric vehicles that are under consideration, but also IEEE, NEMA, and a number of others. That Zigbee we'll get back to in a moment because that's an emerging standard for networking within the home. My point here is if you left it to the individual organizations to work out, they might not get it right. How about we do it like the internet? Well, there's a fascinating story here that I don't have time to get into. Because if you look at internet standards today in the W3C consortium, they're open to everyone. You can download internet standards from the W3C website. But if you look at early development of the internet, which is what we're really talking about, it was government-led. All right, so now I have to do a little bit of law. I know we're not in law school, but I have to do a little bit of law here. The 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act gave NIST and FERC different roles in this process. NIST's role is to coordinate the development of the framework of standards, and FERC's role is to conduct rulemaking proceedings to adopt the standards after they have sufficient consensus. So notice it says, at any time after the work has led to sufficient consensus, the Commission, meaning FERC, shall institute a rulemaking proceeding to adopt those standards. Okay? NIST did 3 different things, including a framework. We're now on version 2 of the framework. It came out last October. That talks about the standards that are foundational to the grid, identifies work that needs to be done, and identifies the standards that are priorities for interoperability. The process works through a panel called the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel that NIST developed. It works with the individual standards development organizations to develop standards. Those standards, if you look at step 8 there, are then submitted to FERC. Here is, in all its glory, what the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel looks like. It has rules, as the standards organizations do, that are as complicated as those of any legislature, including, of course, voting procedures. The stakeholders in the SGIP are wide and varied. They include utilities, IT firms, standards development organizations themselves, state regulators are involved, although not as much as we would like, electric vehicle manufacturers. It's a big family of about 700 members. Not all of them vote, but it's about 700 members. The process leads to acceptance, a vote, by the governing board of the organization, and then today at least, those are entered in what we call the catalog of standards. NIST identified some areas where technical work had not been done. It had priority action plans, plans for how to develop those standards. I wouldn't expect you to memorize any of this. The point was that there was a lengthy process that NIST led, working with the private sector to develop these particular standards. Here's one example of the work that's underway, the home area network. The internet and the smart grid have very different requirements. In the internet, you want to download a movie in 30 seconds. You need large bandwidth to do that. Smart grid will send a price signal to that washing machine. Short burst of data, doesn't need high bandwidth at all. The idea that that washing machine is going to surf the internet, well, maybe the guy who comes along 15 years later will have that in mind, but certainly not today. Number of different communications protocols that are out there, and a number of different consortia, including Wi-Fi, which is already a network that exists within many houses, competing to figure out how that communication among devices is going to be done. One of my friends described a European conference where he went and representatives from these various consortia were there as people who were pleasant to one another during the day, but they were like animals at the zoo just waiting for the sun to go down so they could tear each other to pieces. The competition here has not at all sorted itself out. Okay, so the first 5 standards, not home area network standards, but the first 5 foundational standards were submitted to FERC. FERC held a number of technical conferences and then requested comments from anybody who was interested. It turned out to be mostly states and the utilities. Now, what I say in the article here is it's kind of like being on a first date. We're going to be going, this is truly our first rodeo. We're going to be going through this process many times over. There are going to be hundreds of standards for the smart grid. You're going to send your first 5. They're going to be the no-brainers, right? You'd expect that you would send the first 5 that would be foundational, important to interoperability, but also tested, reliable, and ready. So you've got to figure NIST's expectation is FERC's going to approve them. Most of the comments that FERC got were almost unanimous in their opposition, kind of like the 1984 presidential election. It's centered on 3 different principal objections. The first one was an opposition to mandatory standards of any sort. That is, why is FERC putting a regulator's stamp of approval on the standards? It should be done voluntarily, meaning in keeping with the tradition of voluntary standards. The second one is anything you set in stone now would be technologically obsolescent as soon as it was set in stone. That misunderstands the nature of most technical standards. And then third, they're not mature, they're not cyber secure, but many of these had been used in the industry for years. Utilities in particular had their own objections to the process by which this had been developed. So the box here is a comment from the CEO of a large investor-owned utility who says, we don't think an appropriate level of consensus has been reached. And much of this had to do with that legislature-like process earlier on. The utilities want essentially a veto in that process because they're the ones in the near term who are going to deploy this stuff. FERC had options at this point. It could say that sufficient consensus had been reached. That was a threshold consideration. If you say that sufficient consensus has been reached, that means the voting was appropriate, due process concerns had been followed, and so forth. At that point, you'd have to decide whether to adopt or reject the standards, those left 2 boxes. If you say the process was not proper, you're basically kicking it back to NIST and saying, redo your process. Okay? FERC comes out with an order that surprised a lot of people. We find there's insufficient consensus to adopt these standards, but notice that last bullet there. We believe the best vehicle for developing smart grid interoperability standards is the NIST framework. Okay? The result is chaos. No one knows what's going to happen next. Yes, it's a real head scratcher. No one knows what's going to happen next. There's no guidance to NIST about what to do, except that it does say we think the best vehicle for doing this is the process. When are the standards going to come? We don't know. How fast are they going to come? We don't know. What guidance is there to the states? We don't know. And yet, I'm going to argue this was smart, very smart. First of all, the federal regulation process, making a federal rule, takes time. For more than 100 standards, there would have to be multiple proceedings. The notice and comment process takes time, and there is the possibility that companies like, say, the utilities that don't like the result would sue to block it. Those lawsuits could hold up a rule indefinitely. And judicial review of the rulemaking, that is, what a court looks at when it's looking at one of these lawsuits, is not designed to look at the technical merits of the standards. There's a legal standard there. Has nothing to do with whether the standard is a good standard or one that keeps data secure or keeps data private. Okay? Basically, what FERC has done is the only thing it could do to assure us that a regulator's stamp of approval is not necessary for standards for the smart grid. Okay? In fact, what we can do is follow the process the government-led process of getting everybody together in this interoperability panel, letting that drive the standards, rather than forcing a federal regulator to put its stamp of approval on the process. I call this dynamic fine-tuning federalism, meaning it avoids a clash between the states and the federal government. The states, for now, have their ability to decide to approve or not approve smart grid projects. And the error that Congress made in the statute was to assume that standards could be adopted quickly. They could just be rubber stamped. We could do it more quickly than any other means, and then move on. And FERC's adapting to this reality, and the opposition that it got in the comments about the standards. More importantly, though, this promotes a crowdsourcing of the standards. We've got 700 members of the panel. It's a messy process. I've listened to some of their webinars and the webinars from the governing board of the SGIP. It's a messy democratic process. And there were people who wanted to avoid this. They wanted to avoid what standards organizations normally do. But this, I'm going to argue, is much more fundamentally sound in the long run for the standards for the smart grid, and probably also for the cybersecurity standards, okay, than a central regulator making decisions about what to do. FERC retains the power to intervene if it needs to. It can step in and decide to not adopt certain standards, for example. NIST, for its part, has something called the Catalog of Standards. It doesn't bind anyone. They're not a regulatory agency. They're the people you go to if you want to know whether the atomic clock works. Okay? But that catalog will send signals to the states, and the states will start saying to their utilities, where's the standard? The utility will say, it's there in the catalog. Okay? So what we have here is a situation where instead of a government mandate, we have a much more dynamic situation, but it's one that's probably going to be quicker in the end. What's the lesson we've learned? The lesson we've learned is 10, 15 years from now, when we have to change our mind about what form of regulation works for the smart grid, we'll be able to do that too. Okay, so let me take questions, because I know you probably have some. Anything you'd like to ask? Sir?
Based on what has occurred so far, what changes, if any, have utilities and others had to make?
Have utilities had to make in what regard?
And others on anything. Have they had to offer new things? Have they had to put out documents?
Okay, I'm thinking about a number of different things here. For one thing, some utilities, as I mentioned, have been forced to back off of their more ambitious deployments. Okay? In particular, utilities that came to state commissions and said, we want all of our consumers right now to go to dynamic pricing, have been told in several high-profile orders, you can't do that. Okay? So that's an important lesson for the utilities. Utilities are cautious companies by nature, and they've become even more so as the federal stimulus money has run out and as they've decided what to do. I hope that answers the question. I mean, there are other, okay. Questions? Yes?
Thank you for the lecture.
Well, pleasure.
So you said that we need to find ways to bypass the PUC in order to succeed in implementing the smart grid. What are some of the big barriers that project developers should expect to counter the PUC?
Project developers. For now, a project developer is a utility company.
How about the power producer or microgrid developer?
The microgrid developer is going to be, except for the fact that they're not going to be using dynamic pricing, because they're going to be within their own system, they're going to be largely not constrained by this idea that they're going to be earning a rate of return as the utility would be, but they're going to have to demonstrate if they are regulated, if they're regulated as a utility under the state law, which is an open question, okay, they're going to be supplying consumers, so I assume a microgrid would be. They're going to have to demonstrate the same kind of benefits to ratepayers from their implementation as Excel had to do in Boulder. Okay? I think that what's going to be important in the short term, and let me I'm going to turn that into smart grid generally, is for utilities to demonstrate the benefits and the risks in a business case that's not solely about them. Okay? Microgrid doesn't have that problem because a microgrid's not an investor-owned utility that's responsible to its shareholders. Okay? But the utilities have been far too centered on benefits that accrue to them. And that actually goes back to your question as well. That they need to be much more aggressive. PG&E is a good example of this in California, about coming forward with benefits that actually accrue to consumers from implementation of the smart grid. Sir?
So my question is there any need of, is technology adequate at present which support dynamic pricing, or do we need some innovation like which can promote this faster standardization?
Okay, so dynamic pricing itself has been around for 30 years. A number of utilities have experimented with it since the 1980s. I would say it's actually not a technology problem as much as it is a consumer education problem. I've read a number of the stories about consumer reaction to dynamic pricing. It's very simple. My electric bill is a small fraction of my overall monthly expenditures. Okay? It's a fixed cost to me. It's not something that I even really worry about all that much, except that I adopt energy saving measures in my own house. If you told me tomorrow that I was going to pay the market price, and I use that in sort of a vague way because the various flavors of dynamic pricing expose you to the market in different ways. Some of them are pure market risk, some of them are not. There's that uncertainty. I don't know whether the price is going to go up or not. And frankly, most people resist it on that basis. But when you let people see what it is and you let them have exposure to it, they tend to be satisfied with it after they've been part of a dynamic pricing experiment. The underlying technology itself, simply we need the smart meter to be there, otherwise you can't do dynamic pricing. But the bigger challenge really is getting consumers to understand what this is. And I think that a lot of the opposition that's based in other concerns, like the people who are concerned about the potential health hazards and so forth, come from people who really have no great grasp of what this is or what this could be. So I would say it's more of a consumer education problem, to be honest. Back there.
There was an article in yesterday's Washington Post that the Department of Energy's Inspector General
Yes.
said a lot of the projects that were funded by stimulus
Yes.
dollars
Yes, I've seen
had
this.
inadequate security planning.
Absolutely.
And it was a very broad, there weren't many specifics to the article, but it basically said that the Department of Energy was going to work harder to make sure that people who applied for the funding, that their security plans were adequate.
Yes.
So I guess what is the role of the Department of Energy if they're able to, by means of providing funding, kind of sway the ways in which different organizations are looking at cybersecurity?
All right. Now you have to keep in mind, I've read that report. I've read that report. So what you had was the stimulus bill funded something called smart grid investment grants. And that grant program is the one I referred to in the presentation that jump-started a lot of smart meter deployment. Basically what it did was it gave utilities about half of the money in most cases that they needed to justify their case before the state public utility commissions. Not surprisingly, if I go to you and you're a state regulator and I say, well, half of my money is coming from the federal government, the business case gets a lot easier to make. And so a lot of these projects were underway. The problem, as the DOE's Inspector General found, was that the utilities had only really vague promises about how they would implement these grants and keep the devices secure. They would say things like, well, we will follow normal security practices. Okay? Part of the problem here is that cybersecurity practices for the grid are themselves an evolving subject. But what I found interesting about that particular report is basically hubris on the part of the utilities, that they were taken to task more for what they said about how they were planning, and you used the word planning yourself, for cybersecurity more than what they actually did. In reality, they may have actually done more than they said they were, but the IG focused narrowly on sort of this representations that the grantees were making. Now, most projects are going to be approved at the distribution level by the states. And so it's going to be the states who are going to bear the responsibility for ensuring that whatever standards are out there are followed. But it's an interesting report. It tells us there's a lot of work to be done. Yes, sir?
Let's assume that there is a high penetration of the smart meters
Yes.
in the commercial and residential sector.
Sure.
And who owns the information? So,
What a great
because
question.
let's assume, for example, that the customer, the consumer,
I'm not going to assume anything about this. This is a wonderful question.
so
It's probably the subject of my next article about this.
okay, because
I
if
just said that on video.
if the consumer owns the information, maybe they can sell it to an aggregator, so they can take those patterns and use it in
Wonderful question.
to manage
Yeah. Let me take a crack at this. And again, this is one of those areas where we're truly talking about 1995 and not 2012 because the rules are not fully well developed at all. A number of state commissions, including Texas and California, have actually written rules for who owns all of this data that's coming off of the smart meter. Okay? For the most part, the way I think it's going to shake out is that the consumer owns the granular data, that is, how much your refrigerator used, how much your washing machine used. The people who are concerned about privacy here are genuinely concerned about a utility knowing whether I took a shower at 2 o'clock in the morning after I came back from the bar, okay? But I think the way this is going to shake out is you're going to own that data and have the ability to sell it to the aggregator. The utility is going to be able to own it, have really an aggregate level of ownership of the data. They'll know in a neighborhood how much energy was used at a particular time, but they won't have ownership of how much my washing machine used. I think that's the way it's going to shake out. And that's important both to the privacy concerns, which are substantial, and to the ability, which your question implies, to bring aggregators into the picture. If they don't have data, they can't do anything. If I don't own the data and I can't give it to Verizon or an energy aggregator, they can't do anything. So eventually I think this is going to shake out in favor of sort of that two-tiered model. That's certainly what Texas and California have done. And it's, to me, data is what might actually, data and privacy, might actually drive the creation of the industries by making it possible to sell to the aggregators. There was a hand up in the back there.
Yeah, a lot of your examples have been about retail-facing issues.
Yeah. It's because it's what I know the most about.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask. You know, certainly it's the easiest to relate to.
Sure.
But you know, industry and commercial certainly have as much, if not a larger, impact on electricity usage.
Yes.
Or do a lot of, I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of the examples within that sector, but are a lot of the same standards issues relevant to the industry and commercial clients?
When we talk about the industry, you're talking about industrial buildings, commercial setting. Absolutely, absolutely. Unless they're going to go the route of the microgrid, which is also possible. But one of the things I think you'll see, you're already seeing this with the Enternocs of the world, is that they're effectively being an aggregator for commercial buildings. That's obviously the easiest place to start. Okay? And so firms are going to get their start there. I think that you've got two different problems, and they're actually related in the last two questions. Smart meters generate a lot of data. Utilities have no expertise whatsoever in analyzing this data. Okay? So you're going to get third parties who are going to come in who are going to do two different things, really. The first one is analyze all that data to see how they could tailor demand response strategies to the industrial and commercial users. The second one is eventually they're going to get into the supply business. I call this the Google utility. They're going to get their start analyzing all the data, and then eventually they're going to say, well, now that we know everything about how Eisen's commercial building uses electricity, why don't we just supply the electricity as well? We can make a profit doing that. So the industrial and commercial setting, the standards are important the standards are the standards in some respects, but the ability for an aggregator to go in there is, I think, paramount. You've been waiting for a while to ask a question.
Okay,
Good questions. I like this. I'll stay as long as you want.
Are the states generally supportive of the smart grid, or?
I read I knew somebody might ask me that. That's a good question. I read something yesterday in a newsletter called Smart Grid News about the top 10 states that are encouraging this. I made a very slight reference at the outset to different kinds of states, different kinds of utilities. Okay? It's a very odd landscape here where about half of the states are restructured or deregulated. We use restructured because they're not fully deregulated. And about half are still the traditional vertically integrated utilities. Those tend to be in the South and West. The states that are in the South and West tend to be less receptive to the smart grid than states that have restructured and states in the Northeast and California. The reason for this is really twofold. The first one is the states that have restructured, and by the way, I would include Texas in there. States that have restructured already have experience in bringing competition into the electricity market. The second one is you can bring in that aggregator, you can bring in that demand response provider more easily under that state's restructuring regime than you can when you have a vertically integrated utility. That tends to drive which states are more active in this more than, say, political concerns might. Sure.
You mentioned earlier that, at most people, like individuals, might save about $20, $30 a month,
and you realize I'm just making that figure out.
Sure, and that electric companies, like the status quo in terms of how things are run, and they're comfortable in doing it that way. So do you think dynamic pricing schemes alone, things like that, will drive the change, or would something like carbon pricing need to be introduced for that to be pushed over?
That is an interesting question. A lot of the work here obviously relates to much larger initiatives that are underway elsewhere, so that FERC, for example, has a transmission planning initiative trying to bring new, larger renewables producers onto the grid. It has a demand response initiative out there that might eventually have you get paid for DR, so that when your washing machine or freezer turns off, you might actually get paid for that. And if you know, I'm getting into something like ancillary services here, so that if you know about how that would actually save a utility money, you might actually monetize that stream and do it. To me, something like a carbon tax is designed almost more to bring low carbon solutions onto the grid, and it could encourage things like this, but I haven't really explored the link between the two quite as much. Obviously, in something like residential solar, where I've done a lot of work, obviously something like that would be more of an encouragement. Frankly, I can summarize an entire article for you right now and say that a carbon tax would be much more effective in encouraging solar PV than almost any incentive that's out there right now, and so then we tie it into the grid. But I don't want to use that. That almost implies that I assume a smart grid and assume carbon initiatives independent of that. I really don't. I just haven't had the chance to really link up the two in any systematic way.
Who's next? So you described the difficulties in getting a national standard, but is there any movement to try to take this to the international realm, or does it?
What a great question.
Or does that really matter, other than say U.S. Canada?
Okay, so I'm familiar with European smart grid initiatives, and more intriguingly, the China smart grid initiative, the strong smart grid or strengthened smart grid initiative. One of the issues that we're going to run into is harmonizing the standards at the international level. NIST already has work underway there. It's kind of, we've got our arms full trying to figure out what the standards are here in the United States, but at the same time, we're looking to the Europeans and looking to the Chinese, even more interestingly, to see if we can harmonize those standards over the long term. Those efforts have just gotten underway. And the the Europe, not surprisingly, the Europeans and the Chinese tend to sometimes go their own way in some of this standards development, but there is that work underway to try to harmonize them. I'm actually, with any luck, I'm going to a conference in Beijing in September where I'm going to talk about that precise topic. Next. Somebody, go ahead.
I had a couple.
Our video operator.
When you said that the government decided to go hands-off on the rules, and you talked about all these companies that were competing to get into the home and provide tools,
yes.
I remembered that the EU stepped in and told all the all the phone makers they had to go ahead and use micro USB to go ahead and charge the phones because they were tired of them pushing proprietary connectors and making people buy new chargers every time somebody got a new phone, and that's what led to that. And I'm wondering whether if somebody gets a lot of market power in the home, whether they might start enforcing those costs on people to benefit their own bottom line.
Absolutely. When I say at the end of the presentation that FERC has the right to step in if it so chooses, here's what I mean by that. You've actually given me one of 3 different situations where I think FERC could and should step in. Okay. First of all, the legal framework says if there's sufficient consensus, let's decide to adopt a standard. What I'm assuming is that a standard was developed within the NIST structure for whatever reason that favored the proprietary interest of some company, okay, and has started to get market traction as a result, and push out a competing technology that is equally meritorious. Okay, so it's a VHS Betamax sort of situation. Okay. What I would assume that FERC would do in that instance is actually undergo a rulemaking proceeding, okay, and try to do something about that particular result. But I'm saying that would be a limited instance and it would be limited to the kind of situation that you described. Okay. The other 2 situations are where that I think they might want to intervene are where a standard is not viewed as cyber secure. Okay. And the third one is where the states have looked at the NIST catalog of standards and adopted standards that go off in a balkanized fashion. In other words, California looks at it and says, we'll adopt the standard. Texas looks at it and says, we won't. We're going to do, we're Texas, we always do something the federal government doesn't want. We're going to do it this way, and New York does it a different way, and so forth. FERC might have to step in at that point. I foresee that third result is going to be much less likely actually than the first one that you described. I actually think we're going to find ourselves in situations, particularly in the home area network, from time to time, where FERC will have to step in. But that from time to time is extremely important to me. It's extremely important to me that the central message of what I'm talking about here is that FERC has said, and really in the only way that it could, most of the time this is going to be done by this extraordinary new hybrid framework that's been designed for this purpose. It's going to be faster and it's more in keeping with the tradition of the way we do standards. But if it is not, if for some reason it doesn't achieve national objectives, then we'll step in. It's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
Are utilities opposed to this more because they like the status quo, or is it more...
We were talking about that before we came in here.
Or is it more that it'll affect their profits and their generational portfolio?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so first of all, we can't treat utilities at all as a monolithic entity. Not one little bit here. There are large investor-owned utilities, there are smaller municipal-owned utilities and cooperatives, and even within the large investor-owned utilities, there is I would say, a varying degree of appetite for the smart grid. Okay? Some of them see that it can be that integrating consumer DR can be a very important part of their long-term strategy. The PG&E plan is designed for the next 10 years. Okay? But there are also some investor-owned utilities who want no part of this whatsoever. Okay? And they're the ones who've been resistant to most resistant, I would say, to any kind of federal mandate in this particular area involving the standards. Okay? The utilities rate of return is an interesting consideration because what really is involved there is the utilities going to the state commission and asking for the money to do the project. The money to do the project comes from the ratepayers. Okay? Now, what BG&E did, it overreached a little bit too much. BG&E went to the Maryland PSC and said, we want a tracker. A tracker is essentially rate recovery while we're putting the project in place. So while we're doing it, the benefits haven't been realized yet, of course. We want to be paid for it. We want to get that money back. The Maryland PSC said, no, you can't do that. You know, the more interesting question is what happens when a commission rejects a dynamic pricing scheme, because then it leaves the utility putting a smart meter out there. It's like, you know, it's like putting a prom dress on with nowhere to go. It's not entirely clear how a utility could make the business case for rate recovery of simply putting smart meters out there without any other benefits, except to say it's going to be the benefits on our side, wide area situational awareness and so forth. And that's a much tougher, that really depends on the state commission. Depends on how receptive they're going to be to that. So to answer the question, I mean, varying degrees of receptivity. I do think you will see the most promising experiments will happen in municipal utilities and cooperatives that are not as tightly regulated by FERC. I was telling Will that I visited one project in Austin where there's a municipal utility involved, Austin Energy, and Texas is a deregulated state. They're actually trying to link up 100 homes with a very ambitious test bed of different systems and pilot projects of various sorts. You know, this is a little bit like saying we're going to have a 100-person connected computer network and see what happens. We're a long way off from millions of people selling electricity from their vehicles back to the grid. And some utilities are better at it than others. Some I would say, are definitely going about it slowly. I would count my own utility, Dominion Virginia Power, among them. They've got small pilot projects out there. Handful of communities have smart meters. Very much slower implementation. Yeah.
One other one about market pricing on electricity.
Sure.
When you said it was partly a consumer education problem, I think consumers remember Enron and price manipulation.
Absolutely.
And so what's being done to sort of guarantee that that can't happen again? How can it be built in that manipulation can't be happening again if somebody gets market power and supply or finds a way to game the system so that people don't get a bill for a couple grand at the end of the month?
Okay, so one of the extraordinary developments that's happened in electricity since Enron and the California crisis is the development of wholesale power markets. Okay? And the wholesale power markets are regulated by FERC and by the market makers themselves, and FERC has a much more active role in trying to curb market abuses than anyone did in the Cal PX, Cal ISO market that existed in the California crisis. So Enron was in part a natural gas price manipulation story. It was in part an electricity gaming story. And much of that had to do with the design of the wholesale market in California. Those markets are much more mature and much different than they were at the time. And you would think, at least, that using something that was real-time pricing from a wholesale market, that would be a little bit easier to control. You still run the risk of someone exercising manipulation of a wholesale market, but it is much more difficult to do than California's market was to game in 2000. Okay? Sure.
If the economy goes and if it grows as projected, there is going to be demand increase as the supply is going to be status quo, it's going to go down because of some plants closing down.
Sure.
What is the role of smart grid that's going to play in, and whether utilities will be proactive in deploying smart meters?
My answer to that, I think, is going to be a bit similar to the question I just got about whether utilities have an appetite for this. If you're a utility, you can build a 500 megawatt coal-fired power plant, put up with the regulatory uncertainties in the air permitting and so forth. You can deploy a natural gas plant. You can roll the dice and try to build nuclear. You can have solar and wind and other DG. Or you can have an ambitious DR program that cuts demand by as much as you were going to have to, the capacity you were going to have to build. So the smart grid for the utilities that are thinking about this in depth, they see as really the first fuel. I mean, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy calls DR the first fuel. The easiest thing to do is to link up people with the grid so that their demand can be moderated. And the savings can be enormous. I mean, you think just that air conditioner going off for 15 minutes in the summer, whether it's utility control or my control, you multiply that by 1 million utility customers, the savings can be enormous. And the one thing we do know about electricity is that it's a peak business. The demand for electricity peaks in the summer when people turn their air conditioners on. It peaks during the day and moderates at night. Dominion has a very small project where they're having a second rate for electric vehicle owners who charge in the middle of the night. Okay? And that kind of smoothing out the peak shaving even really, load shedding, is the kind of thing that can be more possible with a smart grid and more useful to the utilities that are willing to embrace it. Okay? And again, in the near term, this might be what the smart grid is. But I really fundamentally think that somebody's going to come along later with something that gets people very excited about it.
Yes, I'm sorry if this is down in the weeds, but I can't help it.
We've been down in the weeds quite a bit here. It's all right. I've been down in the weeds for years with this.
Why would a consumer feel that a smart meter is the health hazard?
Oh my God. RF radiation.
More so than
a microwave oven? I don't know. More so than a cell phone?
More so than a regular meter?
I honestly think, I'm using that as a placeholder for other concerns. I have read, wow, you want to really get in the weeds with this one. I have read a number of websites where people have said smart meters are part of a government plot to take over your houses. Because once the government has data about your electricity usage, that's just one step toward totalitarianism. Really? You know. Oh, okay. Oh, wait, you ready? You've seen one of those? You don't tell me you believe that, because.
Actually, I'm not asking a question, but I'm kind of having my suggestion. So, like, I think we are very much worried about like data going, like how data will be handled, and like so security, etc. So, I think if like utility company are like ready to define, like let's say they have one type of rate during the like up to like 7 p.m.
Sure.
And they have a different rate in the evening.
Sure.
Then all the like homeowners, like who are consuming electricity, they just what they need to do that they have to just give the details that how much they consume during the like cheaper time. Right. So they don't have to supply every information, but aggregately they just.
Right. I mean that's part of what I said. And again, part of what I said in response to that wonderful question about data, which is it's going to drive everything pretty much, is that the utility might simply not have that quantum of information that leads us down the slippery slope toward totalitarianism. I will say, I forgot to say in response to your question that the only health hazard studies I've seen about RF radiation coming off of smart meters are that it's an extremely minimal concern. But it's one that's being deployed by fear. I mean, you see the pictures there. There are websites I've gone on to that are stop the smart meters. Here's the herbal supplement you should take to avoid the impacts of the RF. I'm not making this up. I've seen all these sites. My point about that is really twofold. The first one is that there's an extraordinary lack of consumer education here. Okay? Utilities are not good at it. They've never been good at it. Okay? So the question is, and you can see this in some of the overreaching proposals. They come to the state commissions and say, we want to do everything tomorrow. They spend no time whatsoever telling people what's going to happen when that technician shows up to their house and actually wants to fiddle with the thing that's outside of the wall there. And so people get apprehensive. That stop the smart meter thing was literally somebody protesting in Naperville, Illinois. Don't let them show up and muck with the box. Okay? And I think a lot of this could be handled by much better consumer education about what this is, but a lot of this is also going to depend on having an application out there that people actually want and actually desperately want. because then they'll sell their data to the aggregator. Go ahead.
The meters, the mechanical meters that are present right now in homes, they've been 60, 70 years old. It's time to change, right? So why not just put in a smart AMI system in it? And what is the resistance? Because if you change the meter now, even the utilities, if the cost is only $20 increment.
Well, there's something to think about here. One thing I didn't talk about with the home area network standards is that if you require intelligence in that smart meter to handle different communications protocols within the house. So for example, if you require it to be both Wi-Fi and Zigbee compatible, okay, that might increase, my electrical engineering professor friend tells me, that might increase the cost of the meter by $5, okay? When a utility is deploying 1.3 million meters, that's $6.5 million. That's a lot of money. And it changes the dynamics of the business case. And so what you have is, you have utilities that are saying, we'll put the meters out there, but we're not going to deploy with all the bells and whistles until we know what's out there. And it makes it very difficult to learn what all the bells and whistles could be, because very few utilities are willing to jump in and do the whole thing. You say cost, but cost is dependent on what you want to put out there. Very much so. And what the utilities in Texas and California have learned is, to their chagrin, is they started out with a lower quality meter, and now they found they can't upgrade it. It's not just a software problem. And we're all familiar with that, right? I mean, if you have the computer that, the operating system of the computer is too powerful for the logic board that you've got in it, you have to replace your computer whether or not the software is actually interoperable with what went before it. And that's the situation that utilities in Texas and California are finding themselves in. Another one of those situations where FERC may or may not eventually step in. Questions? All right, thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to talk about this subject, as you might imagine.